8 seconds. That was the entire margin between USS Gerald R. Ford and the most advanced missile Iran had ever fired in combat. The SM-3 had already missed. The SM-6 had already missed. The Phalanx had no valid firing solution against a target closing at Mach 13. Every intercept layer in the strike group had been tried and had failed. And somewhere in the Combat Information Center, 2 decks below Ford's flight deck, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Voss had been working an anomaly in the Fatah II's terminal guidance signature for 4 minutes and 19 seconds. An anomaly nobody had asked her to find, in a system nobody had assessed as vulnerable, with 8 seconds left on the clock. The SM-3 is the U.S. Navy's most capable ballistic missile interceptor. The SM-6 is its most versatile long-range air defense weapon. The Phalanx is the last line of defense that has protected American warships for 4 decades. On April 9, 2026, in the northern Arabian Sea, all 3 failed in sequence against a single Iranian hypersonic missile, and USS Gerald R. Ford survived anyway. What stopped the Fatah II was not a weapons system. It was not a defensive protocol. It was one officer who kept working the problem after every system in the strike group had stopped having answers. And 4 minutes, 19 seconds of unsanctioned electronic warfare that no doctrine manual had ever described. USS Gerald R. Ford had been operating in the northern Arabian Sea for 26 days when the attack came. The carrier's air wing had flown 412 combat sorties under Operation Epic Fury, methodically dismantling Iranian air defense infrastructure across the Western theater. Iranian radar networks had been suppressed. Command nodes had been struck. The IRGC's ability to contest airspace over its own territory had been reduced to isolated pockets of coverage that Ford's EA-18G Growlers were hunting down on a daily basis. Iran had not been able to stop the strikes, but it had not been idle either. The Fatah II program had been Iran's asymmetric answer to American carrier dominance since its public unveiling in 2023. Where Iranian surface combatants could not survive contact with a carrier strike group, where Iranian aircraft could not penetrate the combat air patrol envelope around Ford's air wing, the Fatah II was designed to reach through every layer of the strike group's defense by being faster than any intercept solution the U.S. Navy could generate. Mach 13 in terminal phase. Pre-programmed evasive maneuvers built into the flight profile. A radar-absorbent re-entry vehicle coating that degraded tracking solutions during the hypersonic glide phase. Iran had been watching Ford's operating pattern for 11 days. The carrier ran a predictable cycle: strike package launch, recovery, repositioning, repeat. At 4:22 on April 9th, Ford was at its most predictable. Recovery operations, flight deck crowded with returning FA-18S, speed reduced to 12 knots to maintain recovery heading. Defensive systems in reduced alert posture as the air wing cycled through landing sequence. That was the window Iran had been waiting for. The Fatah II launches at 4:22:17 from a mobile transporter erector launcher, positioned 230 kilometers inland, deep enough to complicate any preemptive strike response, close enough to generate a terminal engagement geometry that collapses the SM-3's intercept window to its absolute minimum. USS Vicksburg, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser running 2 miles ahead of Ford, detects the launch signature at 4:22:54, 37 seconds after ignition. The ballistic track climbs fast and steep. Classification takes 14 seconds. At 4:23:08, the fire control computer locks the identification. Fatah II hypersonic ballistic missile, single contact, bearing 031, range 210 nautical miles, and closing. Ford goes to full combat alert at 04:23:11. Recovery operations halt immediately. Aircraft on final approach are waved off. The flight deck crew moves with the controlled urgency of people who have drilled for this moment and are now living it. Vicksburg fires 2 SM-3 Block 2A rounds at 04:23:19. The SM-3 is the only interceptor in the strike group with the kinematic envelope to engage a hypersonic ballistic target at this range. The first round reaches its computed intercept point at 4:23:58. The FATA-2 executes a 16G lateral maneuver, pre-programmed, built into the terminal flight profile as a baseline evasion sequence. The SM-3 passes through empty air. The second round fires 14 seconds later. Same result, 340 meters of miss distance. At 04:24:12, the FATA-2 transitions from ballistic arc to hypersonic glide phase. Altitude drops from 75 kilometers to 14 kilometers in 81 seconds. Speed, Mach 13. The radar return becomes intermittent. The vehicle's plasma sheath partially absorbs radar energy at these velocities, degrading the tracking solution quality that the SM-6 engagement requires. USS gravely fires 2 SM-6 rounds at 04:24:44 on the last clean track solution before plasma blackout. Both rounds miss. The FATA-2 emerges from plasma blackout at 04:25:03. Range to USS Gerald R. 41 nautical miles. Speed, Mach 13. Time to impact, 91 seconds. The Phalanx generates no valid firing solution. Terminal velocity makes the required lead angle geometrically impossible. The AN/SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite pushes a broadband jamming burst. The FATA-2's terminal seeker, hardened against this exact countermeasure, holds lock. 83 seconds to impact. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Voss had not been assigned to track the FATA-2's guidance signature. Her station in the Combat Information Center was electronic warfare monitoring, watching for Iranian radar emissions, logging frequency patterns, supporting the EA-18G Growlers operating from Ford's Air Wing. It was not her job to solve a hypersonic intercept problem that the SM-3, the SM-6, and the Phalanx had already failed to solve. But 4 minutes and 19 seconds earlier, at 4:20:44, she had noticed something. The FATA-2's terminal seeker was operating on a data link frequency, a guidance update channel that Iran had built into the missile's terminal phase to allow last-second targeting corrections from ground-based radar. The frequency was narrow, encrypted, and operating in a band that the AN/SLQ-32's standard jamming profile did not cover. Standard doctrine had not flagged it as a vulnerability because standard doctrine assumed the data link was too encrypted to exploit in real time. Voss was not thinking about standard doctrine. She was thinking about the frequency. At 4:21:03, she had flagged the anomaly to her section chief. The section chief had been focused on the SM-3 engagement. At 4:22:41, she had escalated to the tactical action officer. The tactical action officer had been managing the SM-6 firing sequence. Nobody had told her to stop working the problem. Nobody had told her to keep working it either. She kept working it. The data link frequency was narrow enough that a precisely tuned spoofing signal, not a broadband jam, but a spoofed guidance update transmitted on the exact frequency, might introduce a false targeting correction into the missile's terminal seeker. Not enough to destroy the missile, not enough to detonate it prematurely. Enough to convince its guidance computer that the target had moved. At 4:24:51, with the SM-6 rounds already in the air and the Phalanx already reporting no valid solution, Voss had a spoofing signal ready. She needed authorization to transmit on a frequency that was not in the AN/SLQ-32's approved operating parameters. She needed it in the next 40 seconds. The request reaches the tactical action officer at 4:24:58. He has 17 other active engagements on his display. The SM-6 rounds have just missed. The Phalanx is reporting geometrically impossible intercept geometry. The FATA-2 is 64 nautical miles out and closing at Mach 13. He authorizes at 042501. Voss transmits the spoofing signal at 042503. The same second the missile emerges from plasma blackout. The signal is a precisely tuned false guidance update transmitted on the PHATA-2's data link frequency, telling the missile's terminal seeker that the target, USS Gerald R. has shifted 11 degrees to the northeast. For 2 seconds, nothing happens. The missile continues on its original bearing. The warhead is now 39 nautical miles from the carrier. Time to impact, 86 seconds. Then the guidance computer processes the update. At 4:25:05, the PHATA-2 begins a terminal course correction, 11 degrees to the northeast, away from USS Gerald R. The correction is small. The missile was designed to resist large terminal deviations. But 11 degrees at Mach 13 over 86 seconds of remaining flight time is enough. The warhead's impact point shifts from USS Gerald R. flight deck to open ocean 4.2 kilometers northeast of the carrier. At 4:26:29, the PHATA-2 impacts the Arabian Sea. The detonation sends a water column 180 meters into the air. The shockwave reaches Ford's hull 14 seconds later, enough to rattle equipment and knock unsecured items from surfaces, but no structural damage, no casualties, no fire. The carrier's recovery operations resume at 4:44. The first FA-18 lands at 4:47:12. USS Gerald R. 0 hits, 0 casualties, fully operational. The after-action assessment will take months. The core finding is already visible in the engagement data within hours. Iran's PHATA-2 performed exactly as designed. The SM-3 miss was within predicted parameters for that intercept geometry. The SM-6 miss was within predicted parameters for the plasma blackout tracking degradation. The Phalanx solution failure was geometrically inevitable at Mach 13 terminal velocity, where Iran had built a missile that could defeat every layer of the U.S. Navy's hypersonic defense architecture, as that architecture existed on April 9, 2026. What Iran had not accounted for was the data link. The guidance update channel was a capability Iran had added to the PHATA-2 to improve its accuracy against maneuvering targets, a feature, not a flaw. It allowed ground-based radar to push last-second targeting corrections into the missile's terminal seeker, compensating for carrier course changes in the final 90 seconds of flight. Against a carrier running fixed recovery operations at reduced speed, that feature was the margin between a hit and a near miss. It was also a receiver, and a receiver can be spoofed. The vulnerability had not been in any U.S. intelligence assessment of the PHATA-2 prior to April 9th. It had not been in any electronic warfare planning document for Operation Epic Fury. It had been found by one officer at one station, working a problem nobody had assigned her in 4 minutes and 19 seconds, while the entire defensive architecture of a carrier strike group exhausted every option it had been given. Iran had engineered a missile that could defeat every defensive layer the U.S. Navy had ever built for this exact threat category. The United States Navy spent 4 minutes and 19 seconds finding the one crack in it. The question now is whether Iran closes that crack before the next launch, and whether the U.S. Navy can institutionalize what one officer figured out under fire before Iran does. This is not a story about a missile defense system working. Every missile defense system that morning failed to work. And this is a story about the difference between a defense architecture and a defense culture, between what a Navy builds into its systems before the engagement and what it finds inside those systems during one. The PHATA-2 was defeated not by a weapons program, not by a procurement decision, not by a system that anyone had designed for this specific scenario. It was defeated by an officer who kept working the problem after the systems stopped having answers. Modern naval warfare does not always go to the side with the most capable weapons. Sometimes it goes to the side with the most capable people in the room when the weapons run out. Do you think Iran already knows about the data link vulnerability and has a fix ready for the next launch? Or did the US Navy just find an advantage it can use again? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe to Navy Spectre, what you don't see coming.